This is Legal Nurse Podcast, the first ever podcast specifically for legal nurse consultants. You'll learn tips, tricks, and strategies that you can use in your LNC career. If you'd love to hold a book in your hands that you helped to write, be sure to pay attention to the information that I share with you during this show. Welcome to Legal Nurse Podcast. I'm Pat Iyer, your hostess of this podcast, which I started in September of 2016 as a way for legal nurse consultants around the world to be able to connect with each other. And I remember I was so excited when we went from one country to 5, and I thought, wow, we're in 5 countries. Now we're in over 105 countries as the podcast increases its reach. Today, we're going to focus on a topic that does not always get a lot of attention when you think about areas for high risk, and that is the area of hospice care. Our guest today has extensive experience in hospice care as an administrator and a person who understands the pros and the cons of this system from the inside and recognizes where there are potential flaws. She provides expert witness services as well as DME observation, which is Defense Medical Exam Observation. Meet my guest, Yvonne Hanson. Yvonne, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Pat. I really appreciate you giving me the opportunity to shine a little light on hospice. Thank you.
And I know that there may be some people listening to this podcast who are not familiar with the term hospice. It may not exist in their country. So let's first start with, what is it?
Well, hospice is a philosophy, first of all, where most people think of it as a place. It's a philosophy that focuses on a type of care for the patient that is not curable, but comfort related. So that makes it more of a philosophy, because if people connect it to a place, they're then referring to where it's provided, and that's a different question. So.
And where can it be provided, Yvonne?
Anywhere, Pat. Hospice it can be provided in a standalone facility, a hospice facility, which there are not as many in the United States as there used to be, but there still are some out there. It can be provided in the patient's home, a skilled nursing facility if they live there, a boarding care facility. It could be provided under the bridge of a freeway in a car if that's where the patient lives. Hospice professionals go to the patient, so where they live is where it's provided.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I know that there have to be criteria in place to identify whether a patient is considered to be ready for hospice or maybe no longer eligible for hospice. What are those criteria?
Thank you for asking that, Pat, because yes, there are criteria. I want to scream that from the rooftops. Medicare provides very specific conditions of participation in hospice. And these conditions of participation are there to guide the hospice professionals in making their selection of appropriate patients. It is very objective, and it is very important that the regulatory compliance measures and the reasons for people meeting the criteria being on hospice are appropriate and chosen correctly, because there's so many research avenues directed at hospice. And if you have people on hospice that do not meet criteria, it skews a lot of the results. And we find that a lot, unfortunately. So the conditions of participation have very specific guidelines for each disease process. There's always a little gray area, but follow those rules and there shouldn't be a problem. And of course, the most important rule is, does the patient want hospice? I mean, that should be asked first. This is the patient's life, the patient's right, and it doesn't really matter what everybody thinks should be for the patient. It's what the patient wishes. So
When my mother was fighting terminal cancer for 12 years, at the very end of her life, she was in a skilled nursing facility. And the decision was, should she go to another part of that facility? Should she go home? Should she get rehabilitation services? Or should she get hospice? And my mother was always a strong person who knew her mind. And I said, Mom, what do you want? Do you want us to get a physical therapist to come in and help build you up, or do you want hospice? She said, I want hospice.
smart woman. How was her experience? I hope it was everything.
It was well run, well organized. She lived for only 2 weeks at home before she died at home. For our listener who is not familiar with hospice services, perhaps you could tell us what is the range of services that might be available?
Sure. Hospice is a service provided to patients who have a life-limiting illness with the likelihood of not living past 6 months if their disease follows its normal progression. And that's key because I know my family are stubborn. They don't follow the rules, and most people don't follow that normal progression. So that it's important to know that, because when people choose hospice, they think, oh, in 6 months, I have to be gone. And no, you don't. Hospice, people on hospice often live longer with the same condition than those who are not on hospice, because they're getting attention, they're getting more visits, they're getting things taken care of. And for that reason, you have to take some of those things and shift them a little to the side, because we never want to give up hope. So going back to your question, hospice is delivering end-of-life care via a multidisciplinary team that consists of a registered nurse. It consists of a social worker, and a spiritual care counselor, and also home health aide. There's also a hospice doctor and such. And this group, this interdisciplinary group of specialists, the social worker, the spiritual counselor, the RN, they go out and visit the patient. They assess the patient, they address issues, they work with the family, and this is the patient's right. This is what is hospice service. It's not a menu of, I'd like this visit by this person and this supply and this bed. No, hospice is an all-inclusive type of care that when the patient goes on hospice, the hospice agency is to provide the medical care, the nursing care, the on-call after-hours attention, the durable medical equipment, the supplies, the medications that are related to the hospice diagnosis. All of those are provided by the hospice agency. So if you think about it, it's similar to those old capitation rates, kind of. I'm trying to simplify something that's not so simple, but I think of it as, there's a daily rate paid for each person on hospice to the agency for which they're on hospice for. And that daily rate is paid whether the nurse or the social worker or the spiritual counselor visit the patient or not, whether they supply DME or not, whether they supply supplies or not. So you can probably see that in cases where patients' needs are not as much, hospice on their end doesn't have to provide as much. yet they're still responsible to provide anything needed. Yet you may have somebody who's in a crisis and they may need multiple visits. They may need daily visits. They may need a different level of care. And so hospice has to provide. So it gets a little challenging for new hospices or owners of hospices who are trying their best to watch their bottom line. And I never like to include that in the same sentence as caring for patients, but sadly, and we'll discuss that later in this podcast, but there are some incredible areas of vulnerability for hospice patients, and there are some very unfortunate things that can happen and that seem to be overlooked. And because these patients are absolutely relevant, because their life is important, I really want to bring about the nuance that these are people, these are patients, and they are important, and they should not be moved aside for all the other conditions and problems. They should be right there, right in the front, because life is important.
You've brought up the subject, and it certainly is something that we should explore as legal nurse consultants. A plaintiff attorney may come to us and say, I've got a family who's concerned about the care that their mother received through a hospice agency. What are some of the liability risks that can come up in this setting?
Well, unfortunately, Pat, there are many. And the liability risks in this scenario that you presented is that an LNC may be reviewing a medical record of a patient on hospice. And first, I want to just clear up the idea that a hospice patient is just a patient at home, like a home care patient. It's a very specific, very different specialty. Hospice specialists are taught to relearn how to document, how to think, how to care for the patient. So it's very important that it's considered that, and that if you have a case that involves a hospice patient, that you do reach out to somebody who is a seasoned hospice professional, because it's such a different learning, it's such a different specialty that there's so much that can be missed if you don't have somebody that knows exactly what to look for. But to get back to the question, the liabilities are immense. Patients not getting visits that they have orders to receive. So frequencies of visits maybe not followed. Doctor's orders being missing. Medications that they're on being discontinued without the conversation with the patient or the doctor who ordered them. Making sure that the primary care doctor of the patient is absolutely involved unless they choose not to be. The reason why these are liabilities is because many hospice agencies are trying their best to do everything that they have to do, whether they have 2 patients or 200 patients, and that's a tough thing to do. And in doing so, they may not provide or not introduce a certain type of care in a way that it should be, so that the patient may not be interested. Patients are entitled to the care, they're entitled to every component of the care, but then you have the hospice that gets a specific amount for each day the patient is on hospice, and they must care for everything. Their rent, their insurance, the pay for their staff, all of it. So clearly, from just a business standpoint, the less an agency has to pay, the more money they're going to get to keep. But in that, I guarantee you, the level of care is going to be suffer. And so those are some components, some areas that the LNC should look at, or invite somebody to join them in reviewing records that has that experience in hospice, because there are many directions it could go, and they're all of concern.
Before we continue, if you're a legal nurse consultant who's wondering how to get more clients, please note, you must be visible. You must stand out and draw attention to the ways that you can help attorneys. How can attorneys find you when they have a need? Becoming a published author of a book is one of the ways that attorneys find you. But the vast majority of LNCs are not doing this. But why? It sounds like a lot of work to write a book. Let me tell you something. It is a lot of work to write a book, but it's far easier to work on writing a single chapter. Wouldn't it help you to have a guide, a person to take you by the hand every step of the way to write a chapter? I'm your guide, Pat Iyer, offering you a chance to share your knowledge with attorneys in my book, Medical Record Analysis. Each chapter is written by a different LNC. You could be one of them. When you make the investment to join us, you and I will narrow down your topic so you can go through our self-paced course. You'll get a complete publishing package that includes editing, formatting, cover design, and book upload. You'll participate in a virtual book launch where you can invite others to learn about the book, and we'll join together to launch an Amazon bestseller campaign. I'll also offer you a guest spot on Legal Nurse Podcast to give you visibility to our listeners in 107 countries. You can share the podcast video and audio files to post wherever you like. I'll make this process as easy as possible for you. Join us by July 30th, 2024 to open the door for more visibility, more opportunity to share what you know, and more satisfaction from the knowledge that you are a published author and ready to help attorneys. Join us now by going to the link lnc.tip/MRA3. And now let's return to the show. Is this a program that's funded by the government? Is this funded by private insurance, or both?
Well, it's a good question, Pat, because hospice originally started out as a Medicare benefit. So Medicare kind of created the conditions of participation and the rules, and so everybody underneath that follows those rules. So whether the patient has Medicare or Medi-Cal or Medicaid, as an example, it's covered the same way. The same requirements of what needs to be provided and covered is the same. If it's a private insurance, they follow the rules of Medicare, even though it's private. Maybe the patient is younger and they have their own medical insurance. Their medical insurance will have a clause for hospice, and it still follows the Medicare guidelines. There may be some settings in which a patient has an HMO medical group, and the HMO medical group may have a list of agencies that they have contracts with, and in such the patient should be able to choose from that list. What you'll find out there these days is that people aren't always given that choice. They're given one hospice to go on. People don't know any better, and maybe there's a conflict of interest in that hospice with the doctor, with somebody else. Attorneys, there's a wide area of support that is really needed in this area for these patients. Yeah, the list can go on, Pat.
Mm-hmm. All right. I remember a case in which an attorney contacted our office looking for a hospice nurse to review a case. It was a pressure injury case that resulted in a pretty significant size pressure sore that developed prior to this person's expiration. In a case like that, what types of things would a legal nurse consultant look for in the medical records that are kept about the hospice patient?
Great question. So what the legal nurse consultant would need to look at in that situation is the assessment of that wound. Is it being documented, monitored? Are they taking pictures and uploading them to the medical record? What treatment has been put in place for that? And is it being followed? Is there any improvement or not? Are the staff of the hospice agency able to provide the proper care for that wound? Are they knowledgeable enough? Do they have the skill set? Or does the hospice have to reach out and pay a wound care company to come in and provide that care? Hospice is responsible for most things that the patient has that happens when they're on hospice. And if we can't provide what's necessary, we need to go find somebody who can. So that is something that's important. People do not have to deal with these wounds. I mean, they happen, but they can be treated. You know, the patients come on hospice for cancer and they get pneumonia. Treat the pneumonia. They're not on hospice for pneumonia. You know, hospice is not dying, it's living to the fullest, to the end. So these days, hospice focuses on that. And there are, sadly, the system has broken, and it's something that really needs oversight because patients are not getting what they deserve. And so the main reason why I kind of came into this realm of legal nurse consulting, so I could uphold, you know, accountability on the part of others where it lacks. And it's a tough thing. It's a tough thing, but we just don't, we can't forget about it. We have to focus. We have to work on it. These are people. This is their rights. This is their life. They don't get another chance. And this could be my family. It could be your family. It could be somebody else's family. So I think we really need to consider that. And if something happens while we have our loved one on hospice and they're living in a nursing home or they're living in a boarding care, and there's any concerns or suspicions or anything like that, we need to look into them. It's our responsibility. And these days, with short staff and not enough financial backing and not enough trained people and people leaving the industry, you know, seasoned professionals leaving, it's hard. It's harder now. So we need to be more aware.
Yeah, I can certainly see your passion for this field. I'm also thinking about the woman who lived next door, or right on the other side of the wall, right outside my window, whose husband was on hospice. She would contact me fairly commonly to ask me questions. He became paralyzed for what was never really clear what the etiology was, or at least I couldn't understand from her when I asked her why he became paralyzed. And he was like that when we moved into this house in 2011.
Mm.
And he lived pretty healthily and pretty successfully with a paralysis.
Okay.
But then he developed Lewy body dementia.
Yeah.
And he started calling the bank and telling them to close their bank accounts because he didn't need money anymore, and became quite demented.
Yeah. Yeah.
And he finally, in his dementia, said to his wife, I want you to kill me. I want you to give me an overdose of morphine and kill me and put me out of my misery. He called 911 and told the police, my wife won't kill me. Well, they came to the house to find out what was going on. And they said to her, it's a good thing you didn't kill him because then we would have to arrest you. You can't kill your husband. So he decided that he would stop eating and drinking. That was the only thing that he had control over. And at that point, she brought in hospice. It took 8 days for him to die. And they were making visits. I went over towards the very end of that 10 days or the 8 days, and he was having Cheyne-Stokes respirations. And I said, please call the hospice nurse, who came and confirmed he was having Cheyne-Stokes. She became so frazzled because he was in need of so much care that she called me over, and I went over, and she said, I haven't been able to take a shower. I haven't been able to eat. He's constantly asking for me. And I said, this is now the time to call hospice again and tell them that you need further assistance. So the nurse came out, made an assessment, and luckily our area has an inpatient freestanding hospice building. So he was admitted and he died within 2 days. They were enormously helpful to her during this process because it was like living for her inside of a nightmare. He kept getting worse. He became less responsive. His urine got real dark. And then he developed these respiratory issues. So I know there are some huge benefits of hospice, and you've also helped us point out or to think about some of the ways that the system is not as effective as it was for my mother and my next door neighbor, but there can be problems in the system. We have time for a couple more questions, Yvonne, and I know that there might be a choice of having hospice care at home or going into a facility if it exists. How much flexibility is there for the patient and the family in terms of choosing?
First of all, I'm sorry to hear about the challenges of your neighbor before her spouse got admitted to a facility. This is what hospice is supposed to do. It's not just care for the patient, it's care for the family. And that's imperative because they're the caregivers. Without the family being inspired and knowledgeable and knowing what to expect, they are going to be terrified and frantic and worried. And that's no way for them to live. So it's a hospice professional's responsibility to educate, to reduce that level of anxiety by providing them the facts so they know what to expect, when it's going to happen, what it's going to look like, so they can be in control of it. And if those things aren't done, it's unfortunate because it can be frightening. On the other side, when they are done, it's an incredibly beautiful experience. But in terms of the choice, a patient, it all depends on their level of ability. If they have the ability to speak for themselves and make decisions for themselves, and their power of attorney is not the one making decisions, then, they may want to live at their own home. That may or may not be possible. Then the social worker comes in and needs to look at funds. Can they afford a private caregiver? Is a family member going to go in and help them? Some people think, oh, when I go on hospice, I'm just going to go to a skilled nursing facility. It's very expensive, about $6,500 a month, and it is not covered unless you're on Medi-Cal. So there's so many little bits and pieces, and that's why the whole family should be in the conversation. So patients do have an opportunity to choose where they want to receive care. But there's more to it than just making the choice. There has to be the financial backing and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And then I've also heard of cases where a patient goes on hospice care, has been suffering from malnutrition and dehydration, starts receiving an adequate amount of calories, an adequate amount of fluids, and they get better. And they are no longer as ill as they were to begin with. Can hospice be something you can get off of?
Absolutely. It's a celebration too, because, sometimes it's just a matter of getting the right attention, the right care, and having people who know what to look for to determine. It's not a quick decision to take someone off hospice. It's an interdisciplinary team decision. Have they shown signs of decline? Have they lost weight? Have they followed some formula, if you will, that dictates whether they meet criteria or not? And you have to look at that, because you may look at the patient and you may think, oh, they look great, but are they declining? Those are the things to consider. And if a patient is determined that they no longer meet criteria for hospice, then it should be presented to the patient and the family that that is what the determination was. And they're given a document that expresses that, and they're given a certain number of days to prepare for having hospice until that time. And while that's happening, the hospice is busy getting the patient reacclimated with their primary care doctor, getting over medical records, getting things in place, because when they've had hospice and they've had DME and supplies and all this stuff, and they're used to it, and then they graduate and they go off hospice, life goes back to the way it was before. So many people call and say, well, hey, I want back, because I want the supplies and the DME and the visits. But the reality is it's all about the criteria and helping the family be set up to prepare. So, hospices should always be there for the patient. And if it's not the right time, it may be the right time later.
Well, Yvonne, I know that there are going to be questions that are going to come up in the minds of the people who watch this podcast on our Legal Nurse Business channel on YouTube, or they're watching it on our website, podcast.legalnursebusiness.com, or listening to it on the audio channels. What would be the best way for them to be able to reach you?
The best way to reach me is, can you reach me by phone? My business phone number is, so that's 661-401-5522. And I also have a website, Yvonne Hanson and Associates, Hanson with an O. You can reach me through there. And I really welcome anybody to call me on a personal level, on a professional level, if they have any questions about hospice. I'd be happy to share what people are entitled to, and it may be different than what you're being told. I'm not affiliated with any hospice right now, and I feel very strongly that every patient deserves what they should feel. I welcome the community.
Thank you, Yvonne. I can feel your passion for this topic and applaud you. This is not an easy area of nursing care, for sure. I can think about the times that I worked on med-surg units that were predominantly oncology patients, and having to call the oncologist to let him know that somebody was just about ready to transition, and seeing the weariness in the oncologist's voice, hearing the weariness in his voice as I was telling him about his patient, to deal with the emotions of the family and the constant losses that occur in this field.
Yeah.
Requires a special mindset, special heart.
Thank you. It's an amazing, beautiful type of nursing, and especially if it's on the right side of the road.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you so much, Yvonne, for sharing with us. Thank you to you who's a listener or watching this on our YouTube channel. We appreciate your thoughts. Add a comment right below this video if you're watching on YouTube. And when you go to podcast.legalnursebusiness.com, there's a little red bar on the right-hand side of the screen that enables you to leave a voice comment or a written comment about the show. We would love to hear from you, to see what you think about Legal Nurse Podcast and what nice words you might want to leave about the value of the show. Please do that at podcast.legalnursebusiness.com. legalnursebusiness.com and look for the little red bell on the right-hand side of the screen. Thanks so much. Stay on just another couple minutes, and I'll be telling you about who's coming up next on the show. I'm Pat Iyer, and I am your host of Legal Nurse Podcast's next podcast. I'm going to focus with you on overcoming writing barriers. We're going to talk about 5 writing barriers and how they hold legal nurse consultants back. You're going to receive some concrete strategies on how you can recognize these barriers and tackle them and overcome them so that you are confident in working with attorneys, you're consistently writing and sharing your knowledge, and you're getting the rewards that come along with being a legal nurse consultant in a very writing-driven field. Your writing skills are critical for your success as a legal nurse consultant. In the next podcast, we'll focus on what holds you back from achieving those excellent goals that you've set for yourself. That's all for today. Be sure to check out this opportunity that I'm offering for a limited period. You'll have a chance to be part of a team of LNCs who are working together and sharing their wisdom by writing chapters for my next compilation book. Go to lnc.tips/MRA3. That's lnc.tips/MRA3.